ovoj ćemo emisiji razgovarati o proizvodnji hrane. Poznata je činjenica da u većim trgovinama i u supermarketima imamo odjele takozvane zdrave hrane. Kakva je ta hrana, a kakva je ona hrana koja nije označena kao zdrava? Kakve su posljedice konzumiranja hrane koja nije zdrava na naše zdravlje i na naš okoliš? Naš gost je gospodin Marc Buckley, vrhunski stručnjak za održivost i održive sustave. Njegovo obrazovanje, područja zanimanja i područja rada su toliko široki da sam odustala od pokušaja da ga predstavim, stoga ću ga zamoliti da nam sam objasni čime se bavi. On će nam između ostalog odgovoriti i na moje pitanje kako hrana koja nije zdrava utječe na naše zdravlje, naš okoliš i našu budućnost. Hello Marc, thank you for joining us today and thank you for joining Earthtrack Association to help us with your knowledge and your expertise and by telling us something about sustainable food production. Tell us please something about your educational background and the projects on which you are currently working.
Sure. Thank you for having me here. And it was nice that we got the opportunity to speak a couple times before, and I love the work and projects you're doing. Let me tell you all a little bit about myself so that you know who you're dealing with, who you're speaking with today, and who you have on your foundation and on your presentation. My name is Marc Buckley. I'm a United Nations Sustainable Development Goal advocate, an activist, an environmentalist, a serial social entrepreneur, and an expert for the World Economic Forum. I do a lot of different things, and the reason is because I take this systems view approach to life. I believe to solve the global grand challenges that we're facing now and the ones that we know are coming in the future can only be solved by addressing a multifaceted systems view approach to solve these problems. This linear or siloed approach to solving problems is not working for us in our world anymore. So I'm originally from the United States of America, but I live in Hamburg, Germany. I've been living in Germany for the last 10 years. I grew up between the United States and Germany for a couple reasons. My mother was German, my grandfather was German, and my grandmother was Austrian from Innsbruck, Austria. And about 7 months before my grandfather passed away, I inherited our family farm. It's a 6th generation now organic farm. It's Germany's largest organic farms and Europe's 3rd largest organic farms. We're in about 20,000 retail establishments through 12 countries in the European Union. We adhere to strict European Union organic practices and standards. And under that company, there are 4 sister companies. Waldeck Hydrokultur Aktiengesellschaft, which is a hydroponic nursery doing plants and salads and vegetables using a hydroponic method and it's 4 generations old. And what we used originally was lava rock. Lava rock is a type of a porous stone that in water we could grow plants and vegetables. And then we have wine orchards and cherry orchards and apple orchards and did apple juice and cherry juices and also wines. And so I come from a long background of family businesses, but also family nature and environment farming businesses. And then I was one of the first 50 people trained by Al Gore as a climate speaker and leader in his ranch in Carthage, Tennessee. Al Gore used to be the vice president of the United States with Bill Clinton. And he is really interesting. He tried to become president in 2000, but because of a dimple chat and voting process in Florida, it didn't work. And then we had George Bush Jr. become president. But he's a strong environmentalist and activist for the climate and has done a couple movies and things, which is really fabulous. And then I'm an expert for the World Economic Forum for agriculture, seafood, food and beverage industries, as well as climate change and social innovation. And I speak and write and help companies at the World Economic Forum and for the World Economic Forum in those expert areas. And then I run an innovation hub at Davos every year on social innovations that solve global grand challenges. For the United Nations, I work on 5 projects, the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, digital ecosystem for the Earth, resilience frontiers, and also Earth School, and the Climate Change Coalition. So I do a lot of different things. And then, I'm an entrepreneur. I'm an adjunct professor at several universities and institutes for executive training, but also for master's level courses, one of them being the Berlin School for Sustainable Futures. So I talk a lot about sustainability. I talk a lot about the future. I talk about resilient, desirable futures, but I also talk about the situation for our global grand challenges and what our world is being faced with right now with ecological and environmental issues and problems that we're having all around the world. And when I speak about those, the biggest topics are really this, and I want to surmise it before we get into our discussion, just so you can kind of know the direction and things that I do, and that we've been led to believe for many, many years that the oil, coal, and gas industries are the biggest causes of human suffering and greenhouse gas emissions, that the automotive industries are the biggest, and the internet and telco and industries like these are the biggest emitters of greenhouse gas emissions, destruction on our environment. And that's just wrong. It's not true. They are in the top 10. Don't get me wrong. They're still doing wrong and they're still in the top 10. And most of those companies are strongly tied to chemical companies, and they are in the top 10 of creating some problems in our world. But the number one cause of human suffering and human illness and health and environmental destruction, so not only greenhouse gas emissions, but loss of biodiversity and other problems, is the agriculture, seafood, food and beverage industries. They are the biggest cause of human suffering, human malnutrition, obesity, health and nutrition problems, but also on environmental destruction and greenhouse gas emissions and the loss of biodiversity. And so I speak about global food reform. I speak about food quite a bit because not is it only the biggest impact negatively on human health and our climate, it's also the biggest silver bullet to do it right and to do it good, to draw down and fix a lot of the problems we're having in our world. If you think about it, it really makes sense because most of us eat food 3 times a day, and we do it every day, 365 times a year. It's our energy source, and so it has a pretty big impact on our planet, but also on our health, us as an individual level. And so that's kind of what I do, who I am, and what I talk about. And we can get into the science, and I could tell you I have degrees from several universities and institutes, but I don't think those are important. The most important thing is not really me or who I am, it's the message that we have today for you. And I hope in our discussions and questions, some of these positive things will come out today.
Thank you, Marc. You are a perfect expert to talk about these issues, and it's really wonderful to have you here. Thank you. What you mentioned about the food, that it's eaten 365 days per year, I remember the saying of our mutual friend Andreas Vilgerdes, who said, Eat as if your life depends on it. And it actually does, and we should take this very seriously. But what I wanted to ask you about the food production is that in people in Croatia, including some experts, and they believe that the food production without the use of pesticides is not possible. I talk to people in public market who sell food, mostly potatoes, and they say that it is not possible to get the potatoes without the chemicals that kills a potato beetle. And talking to some experts, they also believe that it's not possible to have a sustainable production without the use of chemicals. You yourself said that you are the owner of the land and that your ancestors produced organic food back in 6 generations. So what is your experience? Is it possible to produce the food without the use of chemicals?
Absolutely, yes. And I'd like to go back a little bit to what you said, where Andreas Vilgerdes said, eat food like your life depends on it, because it does. It's not a joke. It's not a funny saying. It's actually the reality. If you think about it, the human battery that drives our engine, that keeps our body temperature regulated, which gives us energy to move, is food. That's our gas tank, that's our fuel, that's our energy source on how we can regulate our body temperature and also have the energy to function and do things in our world, is by eating food. And they say a calorie is a unit of energy. It's a measurement of energy. It's a caloric intake. And energy is, if you look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs and humanity's basic physiological needs, which are depicted on Maslow's hierarchy of needs, the very bottom layer, the physiological needs, says air, breathing, and water. So air, breathing, food, and water. And basically, those are the physiological basic needs of humanity: security of body, security of resources, and food. That is what we need to survive. So it makes sense. And what has happened over the years is we are cheapening food, which in turn cheapens life. When you cheapen food and produce it fast and easy and on high industrial production monoculture, what you're doing is not only you're cheapening food and you're losing the minerals and nutrients and vitamins, but you're cheapening life and you're cheapening long-term life. My family company still produces over 165 different products for 20,000 retail establishments using organic farming, European Union standard organic farming practices, which are good methods and do not need chemicals and pesticides and methods that are hurting our soils or hurting our food that we produce. Now, don't get me wrong. That's not the best way to do it. I want you to know that organic is great, but the European Union, the EU, organic standards, in my opinion, the bar is set kind of low. I think we could do a lot better and make our food even better with certain practices. Now, don't even get me started on speaking on the United States of America, because their organic standards are much lower than the European Union. So again, in my opinion, they've set the bar just as low as they can possibly go. So I think in the EU, it's nice because we have some good standards, but in my opinion, we can do much better. We can set the bar higher on the regulatory and requirements on what we can do to produce organic food that is quality and free of pesticides, chemicals, or harmful substances, but bring more nutrients and vitamins and minerals and phytonutrients back into our foods that we eat, to help human health, to give us that resilience and that resistance to potential pandemics, potential illnesses that start in our body, start in our gut, to weaken our immune system, things that we can eat that will take food as a medicine and actually boost our immune system and give us a lot of strength, that if we get a bug or we get something, that we'll be able to fight it off better, to have a little bit more resilience to make it through hard times. And the reason, and I just, before I move on and answer that question for real, I want to put a little bit of focus on why I said I think the EU organic standard could be a lot better, that the bar is set pretty low on those standards, is because Spain is part of that EU organic standard. And if you were to, I believe the name of this area is called Almería in Spain. If you would fly over in a plane or a helicopter or in a drone over the largest organic farms in Spain, where they make the melons and strawberries and the organic foods for most of Europe in Spain, you would look out the window of the airplane or the helicopter, or you'd view from the view footage from the drone, you'd say, oh my God, how did all these refugees get up into Spain? What are all these refugees doing in Almería in Spain? And the person next to you who was from Spain, he'd say, man, dummy, that's not a refugee camp. That's our European Union standard for organic farms. And the reason you'd think that they're refugee camps, because they're covered in tarps and greenhouses that look kind of similar to a refugee camp. But let me tell you what, they not even at the standards of a United Nations refugee camp. They're at a horrible condition for EU organic farming, where the workers there are being paid poor wages. They're living in shanty huts around the nurseries, around the organic farms. They're defecating in the open. They don't have running water. They're urinating in the open. There's no sewer system. There's no nice working conditions. They're not making a fair wage. But guess what? That's the majority of European Union organic food is being produced in Almería. It's one of the biggest producers in all of Europe. That's why I think the bar is set too low and the standards are too low, because we're cheapening food. And in that process of cheapening food, we're cheapening the life of workers. We're cheapening the nutrients and the minerals that could be really going into those foods, which not only transportation, good working conditions, and the true environmental cost of how to produce those products really needs to be set deep within that. Now, I've gotten off on that tangent too long, but I want to make that clear to you, and that this is a world with us all. It's not just one place producing all the food for all of us. We need a little bit of resilience and some sustainability to be able to do it ourselves, to be able to support our own country and not rely on the EU or the United States or Spain to provide us with our food. Because let me tell you what happens if another pandemic occurs, if a natural disaster or hurricane or something hits Almería or another place that produces the majority of our food. I guarantee you they're not going to say, boy, we got to make sure we deliver our food to Germany, that they get their food this year. They're going to be worried about their own selves, or they're going to be worried about fixing their own infrastructure. And so that's why it's important that we kind of not become independent or separate from others, but that we start to provide and be producers and doing things smart for the long term for ourselves. Now, the organic process, especially the EU organic process, is something that is very durable on a very large scale, millions of metrics of tons. And it's important because here's what happens when we use chemicals, pesticides, certain fertilizers on our crops in regular monoculture, industrial agriculture. One, we see biodiversity loss in our soils, and our soils degrade over time. The United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization, the UNFAO as they're called, said back in 2015 we have 60 harvests left with traditional monoculture industrial agriculture. I want to give you the update to today. We don't have 60 harvests left. We only have 45 harvests left. And that number is growing exponentially because we have more pandemics, more climate change, and more chemicals and fertilizers being used in industrial agriculture that are ruining our soils, our biodiversity, that are creating problems with industrial agriculture being a thriving model that can be pushed out now only 45 more crops. And that's not 45 more years, that's 45 more harvests. So I want that to be very clear in your minds that you need to take the higher road. If you're producing food, you need to think about food differently. That food cannot be grown on arid or desert or sandy soil that has lost biodiversity, because plants get their nutrition, their minerals, their vitamins, not only from the soil, from the rain, the moisture, from the aerated soil, from the biome, the microbes in the soil, the types of fertilizer that make the soil rich and aerated with lots of microbes and good probiotics inside the soil that go to feed and make that plant thrive and grow with agriculture as we've known it in the ground. And so there was a great movie that came out this year. It's on Netflix for any of those who want to watch it. It was called Kiss the Ground. I would totally recommend that all of you go out and watch this movie. There's a way that you can have a viewing party and watch it even for free if you don't want to watch it on Netflix. But it talks about the loss of biodiversity. It talks about the problems with our soil, how we only have 45 harvests left, and it's a real big issue. But the positive, wonderful light of it is those farmers, those food producers who are switching to permaculture, who are switching to regenerative agroforestry or agroecology, regenerative ranching practices, are doing amazing things to heal our soils. Now, you may ask, okay, well, but we don't get any kickbacks from the chemical companies. We don't get any kickbacks from the seed companies. We're not getting the subsidies or the fundings from those other companies. But I'll tell you what the Rodale Institute, what this movie shows you, and what the majority of the farmers who have switched to regenerative ranching, regenerative agroforestry, agroecology have learned is that they have a diverse amount of crops, numerous amount of crops, not a monoculture anymore. They can sell throughout the entire year, that their profits have went up. By doing that, they're gaining more water, they're healing the soils, they're letting the soils regenerate and rejuvenate so that they can have other crops over time. And what they're saying is that there's another practice that goes hand in hand with regenerative agriculture that is even better to let the soil regenerate itself, and it's called no-till farming. And they're doing it on a large scale with big crops, with potatoes and crops where they're not even having to till the ground. For a lot of people seem to think that farming is a natural thing. Farming is not a natural thing. Farming is a science. And the minute we began to infect the environment of our world, have an effect on our world by putting carbon emissions and greenhouse gas emissions in our atmosphere, was the moment we started to move rock, cut down trees, and till our soils in farming. And we've been doing it for 12,000 years. And since the Industrial Revolution, very intensively. And every time we till the soil, every time we cut down trees, we move rocks, we're putting more carbon from that soil that's locked up in the soils back into the atmosphere. Another thing that most people don't know is that carbon actually goes to feed plants. Plants and grasses capture carbon from the atmosphere. They create oxygen. um, as well as trees. And so we need to understand how carbon and greenhouse gas emissions not only work in farming, but how they work in our atmosphere, how they work on our human body, and how it's all kind of tied together. Now, not only does our world have a biome, that is very delicate, but our body has a biome, and those two go hand in hand. We've seen that the worse the biome of our Earth is usually a strong indicator that the biome of the human body, what we call our gut health, is also doing bad. And that goes back to what I was telling you about immunity, having a strong resistance against bacteria, or our immune system is strong enough to ward off colds and other problems that come along. That is part of our biome, our gut health, and having pro and prebiotics. And back when my grandparents were older, they did it with a lot of preserving, canning, and fermentations of foods, cooking in different ways, using a lot of the natural microbes out of the soils, and those were still vital for us in our food. And so I hope that answered your question a little bit on whether organic is true, but kind of the direction of our world that we're taking and where we really need to go to fix some problems. I see what's happening in a lot of areas around the world, and I want to give you this as one last example, is that when places like the United States or very farm-intensive places like Germany have depleted all their soils or used all the chemicals, and they're starting to run into problems like dust bowls or deforestation or drought or desertification in their soils and the places they used to farm, what they do is they immediately find, and I'm sorry to say it, they find the dummy countries around the world who aren't developed enough or aren't smart enough to know that they just ruined their own land, and now they look for your land to use their chemicals on, to use their bad farming practices on, so that you can now destroy your land and your property, and produce food for them or produce food for yourselves in a bad way. And that's not a model we want. We want to start going in a different direction and use models that are much more efficient. So I'll let you ask your next question. Hopefully I answered that.
Yes, thank you. That's amazing. I believe that our conversation will help us, help our country not to continue be that kind of country. And it's amazing that you mentioned the movie Kiss the Ground. It's a wonderful movie. I watched it and I recommend to all people to watch it. It's really important to know these facts and details. And I wanted to check one thing that you mentioned. When you talked about nutrients, you said that conventionally grown food doesn't actually contain the same amount of nutrients as organic food. Is that correct?
That's absolutely correct. There's more nutrients, vitamins, and minerals in organically grown food. It's also better. It's also, pesticide and chemical free. There's no certain amount of bad things in our food or in our processes that hurt us in there.
You also mentioned biome. How is it related to organic farming? For example, raising livestock. I know that when you raise livestock, you have to produce huge amounts of food, and you need large areas of soil to grow this food. I also believe that livestock feed does not have to meet high standards, and that these feed contain pesticides and other contaminants. So how does the livestock farming affect our environment and our health in the end?
Thank you for asking that question. So livestock production and animal food, meats in general, are very controversial, but I want to just put it into perspective. There's no one quick answer to answer that properly, because it's a multifaceted, complex problem and system with livestock. And with traditional animal agriculture, the way it is, we run into several problems. The proteins that are used out of a cow, a pig, sheep, goats, the amount of proteins that we get out of the end product after they're delivered to the grocery store is a small fraction to the entire animal. And those proteins are imbalanced because the animals are the middlemen in the process of getting those proteins to be able to eat. And that process is exorbitant amount of water that goes to feed those cattle or those animals while they grow up before they can go to slaughter. Secondly, an exorbitant amount of food, and most of that food is not grass-fed food. It's corn, soy, and other bad intensive, also water intensive, but also land intensive products just to feed those cows. But then there's a couple other things. They usually are in these massive animal agriculture where the cows are in tight, close quarters, standing on top of their shit on piles, and there's a couple other things that come out of that, not only for us and for the earth and the environment, but for the cows. It makes them sick because they're not getting a lot of movement. They have a weaker immune system because they're around all that shit and bad food themselves, and probably even bad water in some extent. They tend to get sick, and so they need to have antibiotics to make sure that they don't get sick. And so sometimes they're given antibiotics. But then all that shit that they have, or the burps, turns into methane. It's actually methane. And they actually are saying that for cows, the burps are worse than the farts, but it's also really bad when they're standing around on piles of this manure, and this is methane that comes out. But it not only goes to our air, which makes the air warmer. Methane is a greenhouse gas, so it makes our atmosphere warmer. But the smell and the methane that comes out is also toxic for breathing. It's a different form. It's almost like asthma or severe air pollution. It's hard to breathe. It's something that's not good for human health if you're close to that type of a facility. And then the last part is that waste, the gooey or the watery part of the methane and the pee and the urine from those cows, it leaches into the ground, and it goes into sometimes holding tanks and sometimes runs off into our waterways and into other agriculture areas, and it's contaminating our waterways. And those antibiotics and those bacteria and those things are going into our waterways and creating secondary problems for us. And that's just a huge imbalance in animal agriculture. Now, there is a good way, and I tried to touch upon it a little bit, to do animal agriculture, and that's called regenerative ranching. And that means that animals only graze on 1 hectare of land from one day to 1 week at a time, and then they're moved to another spot and don't ever come back to that same spot within the same year. It has to be a whole nother year before they get back there. And then as they walk on the grass, as they walk on that soil, as they poo and as they pee on there, as they eat, and that what it does is it heals the soils. It puts that natural manure back into the ground, the pressure puts those microbes back in the ground, and actually heals our soils. So in hilly and outdoor, involved around trees with the right types of grasses, not only does that help to capture those emissions, but it also helps to heal our soils if it's done in a regenerative ranching type of practice. So there are some practices that move in the right way, but they're much different than industrial agriculture is currently. There is something, if you don't mind, that I would love to share with you. around animal agriculture, if you don't mind. It's just a short little video that I want you to watch that can say it, and it's from mutual professors and friends of mine who speak about this all the time, and it's also from a movie that's Creative Commons and open source that I would suggest you watch the full part, but I definitely would like to share it with you and show it to you right now. I'm going to share my screen.
Great.
And show you this real quick so that, because it can say it a lot better than I can.
And I knew I was full of shit. I created this flexible morality that was convenient for me, because if you don't eat meat, you're some sort of vegan that shrivels up into a string bean. In my mind, I justified it. There's enough cows on the planet, they're not going to go extinct. But the longer I thought about it, the more I started to accept what I already knew. The easiest way to protect other animals is just not to put them in your mouth. This whole fantasy that we need meat to get our protein, it's actually bullshit. I mean, look at a gorilla. A gorilla will fuck you up in 2 seconds. What does a gorilla eat? I just do the same things as these big grey things out here that we're trying to protect, elephant and rhino. I just stick to plants. The rangers that we support patrol 5 million acres of wilderness, protecting these endangered species. But the actual biggest threat we have is the meat industry and the land that they are continually taking away from what we have left of these natural wilderness areas. Inch by inch, yard by yard, mile by mile.
About 3/4 of all the agricultural land in the world is used for livestock production, and it imposes a huge cost on biodiversity. And what is the single biggest source of habitat destruction? It's the livestock sector.
Meat, dairy, egg, and fish farming use 83% of the world's farmland, yet provide only 18% of the world's calories. The reason livestock require so much land is because, once again, animals are just the middlemen, consuming, on average, 6 times more protein than they produce. With more than 70 billion animals consumed globally each year, growing animal feed requires vast amounts of land, making it one of the leading drivers of deforestation. It also requires huge amounts of water.
Meat plays a disproportionately large role in causing this overuse of fresh water. 25% of the rivers in the world no longer reach the ocean because we're taking out so much water to produce animal feed.
Water has been fed into the grain that's been fed to the cattle. The cattle's being made into beef. One hamburger is 2,400 liters of embedded water. That's a heck of a lot of water.
All told, more than 1/4 of humanity's fresh water consumption goes to produce animal foods. And it's not just water depletion that's an issue, it's also water pollution. In the United States, for example, farm animals produce nearly 50 times more waste per year than its entire human population, polluting rivers, lakes, and groundwater all across the country.
The livestock sector is responsible for 15% of global man-made emissions. So to put that in perspective, that's about the same as all the emissions from all the forms of transport in the world, all the planes, trains, cars, vans, and ships, all added up.
Agriculture is not only the biggest culprit threatening the future for humanity on Earth, it is also the biggest and most important silver bullet to a solution.
In the US, where meat consumption is 3 times the global average, shifting away from an animal-based diet would reduce agricultural emissions by up to 73% and save 1 million liters of water per person per year. Globally, this shift would free up a total area of land the size of Africa, taking pressure off many of the world's most endangered ecosystems and species.
The message is overwhelming, both for public health and environmental reasons. The more plants you can eat and the less meat and dairy you can consume, the better.
So thank you very much for bearing with me on that, but I really wanted to show it to you because it's something that is so succinctly and nicely said, and it sums up big data, big numbers in a way that's understandable. But basically what I said before the video was exactly the same thing. It wasn't just not done as eloquently. And so as you can tell, it's a big system, it's very complex, and I was only just tickling the surface of some of the problems. But I hope with that and with my comments that I answered your question.
Yes. Thank you for sharing this video with us. It's really inspiring, and it has a great point and gives direct messages. It gives figures and facts, and it's really important that these facts reach people. Ethical vegans already know this information. Vegans do not consume animal meat because they do not want to participate in exploitation and killing of animals. It's out of compassion, but regardless the ethical side, the consumption of the food of animal origin is affecting our health and the health of our environment and nature. And the livestock industry has an enormous environmental footprint.
What I wanted to say is that part of that film, which is interesting, what you just said about vegans, that film was made by James Cameron. He's the producer of the Titanic and many other Avatar great movies. Arnold Schwarzenegger, who's a bodybuilder, who is also on a vegan diet, and Jackie Chan, who is also on a vegan diet, and are all athletes. And in the rest of that movie that you didn't see, it's actually a movie, talks to athletes who are on a sole vegan diet and performing at the top of their class. And so it's a lot about nutrition and how those diets can really help. And so I just wanted to make that clear, what the level and the knowledge of fabulous, great people are telling us about, that there's a better way to do it and there's a different way. And then all those in the clip that I showed you, those are all scientists and doctors and researchers, professors at university around sustainability and food.
I have studied many sources that support plant-based nutrition and the use of organic food. But here in Croatia, we do not have enough available sources. People don't know about the problems related to food production, and the media don't talk about it. When I look for the information, I have to know exactly what I'm looking for. I have to use a targeted search. So why don't people know more about these problems? And what are the consequences of the meat consumption? What actually happened with the food industry on the global level recently?
I think the problem is much deeper. I think it's much older. There's a couple things that have happened. One, in 2008, the entire world was facing a big financial crisis, economic problem, financial issues, and all our tech stocks, real estate stocks, internet investment stocks, technology investments, they all switched in 2008 to food system investments. And the reason why is what I told you earlier, is that everybody eats usually 3 times a day. It's the most secure investment, long-term investment that can ever be made. The problem is when we made that switch in 2008 during this financial crisis, we turned food into a commodity. And that's when we cheapened food. We turned it into a commodity, and those who were behind, not only the production companies, but behind the investments on how that industry functioned and works all over the world, turned it into a commodity, which means they didn't care what kind of nutrients, minerals, and vitamins went into the food. They didn't care how it was produced. What they cared about is how can we produce it as cheap as possible and sell it for as much as possible so that we can get a profit and return on our investment for the money, because we're investing in those companies, we're investing in those food systems. And so because we made food a commodity, we actually cheapened food, which then cheapened life. And we've been on that path since 2008, and it's only gotten worse. So in this industry, the agriculture, seafood, food, and beverage industry, we waste today, this pandemic 2020 numbers are 40% of everything we produce, everything we touch, we waste. And I want to make it clear to you what that means. So you've probably heard before, and when I was younger, it started out at 20% food waste worldwide. And then 2015 to 2018, it was 30%. Now it's 40%. But what does that 40% mean, and how do we understand it, even if we've heard that number before? Well, it means that all the finite resources, the water, the soil, the land, the minerals, the seed, the time, the harvest, the labor that went in to plant, grow, produce that food, all the packaging, the market, the labor, the transport, the greenhouse gas emissions that were made in the production, transportation of that food, that they all went to waste. But it doesn't stop there. It's not just a 40% waste, it's an exponential waste. And let me tell you why. Because there's three top ways in our world that we dispose of food waste, of this waste. And the first way is we bury it with dirt in a landfill. The second way is we burn it and dispose of it by burning of it. And the third way is we dump it into our oceans or waterways. Well, that first way is the worst way possible, because when you bury food in packaging or not in packaging, or you put it in a landfill, it aggregates, it ferments. And in that anaerobic process, it turns into methane. And methane is 80 times more effective at trapping heat and is a greenhouse gas emission. So now you've just taken a 40% waste of finite resources that we don't have, and you've turned it into an 80% waste, which is actually 100% waste when you put the two of them together of what we're wasting, and we're creating a greenhouse gas emission called methane, which is 80 times more effective at trapping heat. It is a greenhouse gas emission, and it's more effective and stronger than CO2, carbon dioxide, in the short term. And what short term means is 10 years. And so most people don't know that. And so I want to put that into perspective for you. If you like Tesla cars and Elon Musk, and you were to go to Elon and you say, hey, you just produced this Cybertruck, this cool looking space Cybertruck. We want you, before you start selling any of them, just throw 40% of them away. He would say, what? I'm not going to throw 40% away. That's a bad business model. Why would I do that? Or if, let's say you go to BP or Shell or OPEC or Exxon, the oil, coal, and gas companies, and you say, you just dug all this oil out of the ground or this coal out of the ground. Go ahead and throw 40% of it away first, and then go ahead and start selling it or put it in reserves. They say, oh, that's a bad business model. Let me tell you what, we've been doing that business model in agriculture, seafood, food, and beverage industries for 12,000 years, and even worse since the Industrial Revolution. People don't understand. And here's why it's so crazy. It's our energy source. It's our battery. It's what feeds us. That's like throwing gas away for your car, your engine. It's our basic needs, Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So we need to change that model, and that's just one facet of the big facet of our food problems and our food systems. And so, as you could tell, I'm very passionate. I love to talk about food, and I like to help people understand the journey of how we can do it better, how we can produce better, because it's not about the brands of the future, whether it's organic or vegan or vegetarian or this space food or that space food or this food tribe. It's about how we produce in the future that will solve our human health and malnutrition problems, our obesity problems, our immune system problems, and our environmental and ecological problems, and our biodiversity and our biome problems. That's what will help us the most when we change how we produce those things. And we do it without waste, without hurting our planet, without hurting our soils. And that's a long-term sustainable model that we can run out forever in the future, and we'll still have good food, good health, and a better future. But if we continue on the current business models, the current systems, what we're doing is we're betting against ourselves. We're making a bad investment that we want our future to fail, because those are all systems that eventually will have a limit to growth. They will eventually end, and the end doesn't look very good.
Yes, when you present it in this way, we really need to ask ourselves, what are we actually doing? The European Commission has issued strategic documents to help preserve biodiversity and to support healthy food production. Some of these strategies are EU Biodiversity Strategy for 2030, then Farm to Fork, and the others. And member states seem to be reluctant in implementing these strategies. For example, in conversation with the Minister of Agriculture in Croatia, I've learned that she thinks that a ban of, for example, glyphosate in Croatia would put Croatian farmers in a bad position because we import food that is produced with glyphosate. But is that really the case? Do we have to wait for all EU members to ban toxic chemicals? Or would it be wise to produce healthy food and thus become competitive in the market? Do we need to change our priorities? So, what can we do to be able to produce healthy food and provide healthy food for our citizens?
I want to answer that in a little bit more of a complex way, but I do want to answer it for you. So, first of all, producing any foods with strong chemicals, pesticides, fertilizers it's just not an intelligent thing to do. It's not healthy. It's not going to make you better. It has no beneficial benefits to do that. So it's a bad model. It's a short-term model that could only be justified in certain extreme conditions. And in the United States, there's been numerous lawsuits, and lawsuits won over glyphosate, monosodium glutamate, glyphosate, and chemicals, roundups, and all sorts of things that are products that go into the food production and that are just not very good for human health, and have shown to produce cancers, have shown to produce unhealthy results for human beings. And so I really want to negate anybody for thinking that even another month of continuing in that practice, that's something that's positive or should be done. Now there's a thing. It's really hard for people to make that transition from one day to the next, from using chemicals and pesticides and fertilizers in their food production to transition to one that doesn't, to organic. And there's farming regulations that also, there's a transitional phase. So you can't one day have a chemical intensive farming and then the next day have an organic, because the soils and everything aren't ready, they're not prepared, and they probably still have those chemicals and those things there that would prohibit that transition that fast. And so that is really why I would say it's a transition and it's something that needs to be worked on. But to say that we're going to wait for someone else, or to say we need to wait till the regulatory agencies tell us they're already behind, they're already doing things not the right way, And they're strongly influenced by lobbyists from food and chemical companies that are lobbying and paying lots of money to continue those type of business practices. It's better to create a new business model and use examples like the Rodale Institute and many other worldwide examples of new farming practices that are much more resilient, much more diverse, offer you more products, more stability long-term throughout the years, that are a better business model that give you not only self-sufficiency as a farmer, as a food producer, but also give you sustainability, and more so than sustainability, give you resilience in your business model so that no matter what happens tomorrow, that you will have the biodiversity in your farming, the multiple crops and cultures, the safe biome, the healthy soil, that you will be able to capture water, to have no dust bowls, to have no water runoff from your soils, that you will be able to keep in your farmland healthy and biodiverse plethora of different types of crops to use, that it will all be benefit not only to you as a business, as a farmer, and to those who you sell your products to, but also benefit to the environment and to human health. It'll also help you reduce that waste and those things. So we need to move into more IMO standards, which is indigenous microorganisms usage, which is organic in the usage of our soils, so that we can get that nice biome and that good soil health up, and some regenerative practices, permaculture, regenerative agroecology, regenerative agroforestry back into our farming system, and not wait to be the last on this. Croatia has some pristine places that can really do a multi-diversity of things and produce wonderful foods, not only for Croatia, but also if they want to export to other places to make a profit. There is something that really needs to be looked at and thought about clearly. Do not produce, buy, or sell food that is not made at the true cost and the fair trade of and value of food. And what I mean by that is, I'm going to give you an example from Vietnam. A lot of avocados and mangoes come from Vietnam. A lot of avocados come from Mexico. A lot of mangoes come from Vietnam. And both of those places, if I were to have them delivered to Germany, and let's say one avocado was €1 and one mango was €1, I want you to, with your true conscience, tell me if that's the true cost or the fair trade of an avocado from Mexico or a mango from Vietnam. The answer is absolutely not. No way is the labor, time, marketing, transport, the water, the planting, the harvesting, the shipping of that mango from Vietnam going to be worth the true cost of €1 in Germany. And when we cheapen food, we cheapen life. Someone is paying the price. Probably the environment of Vietnam, wherever they're making that mango, is paying the price, but also the farmer that's producing and harvesting and transporting is probably poor, probably not making very much, probably in poverty to produce your food. And that's a system that needs to be broken and needs to be fixed worldwide, globally. That's why we need global food reform. And to lastly hit it home, to put it into perspective for you so that you can understand what I'm saying with these principles of how food should be produced and the direction that we need to go, is that, let me give you an example of New Zealand or Australia. They produce a lot of animal agriculture, a lot of beef, cattle, sheep, goats, pigs, swine, and they ship it all over the world, Europe, but they also ship a lot to China. Out of all that they produce, I've asked them both, I've asked the farmers and done general numbers for the country in general, more than 95% of all that animal agriculture that they produce in those countries gets shipped to some other country. It doesn't remain in Australia, and it doesn't remain in New Zealand. And not only does it get shipped somewhere else, it's not being shipped at the true cost, the fair trade, the price of the water, the environment, the land, the resources, the logistics to produce that. And then they ship it to somewhere else. So they're not making the right wage, they're not making the total environmental cost. And the reason that's important, because, and here's where I'm going to get harsh, they're basically telling other countries, please come and have your animals raised in our environment, our land, let them shit and pollute our environment, degrade our soils, use our food, and then we'll ship it to you at a less than cost. And we want to be stuck with all the environmental impacts, the brush fires, the certification, the floods that we have because we're doing intensive animal agriculture, these intensive, big, huge farm factories, animal farm factories, and we're stuck with all the brunt of that. And so that's basically like saying, if you lived in an apartment, you'd invite 10 of your friends to come over and say, please come over, dirty all the dishes, make a mess, don't clean up, never take out the garbage, don't flush the toilet, don't drain the bathtub, just use it for a month, and then when you're done, just leave. It's the same thing. They're not paying you, there's no fair wage, they're using resources. It's just in a bigger closed system. The impacts aren't immediately felt, but in a few years later, Australia or New Zealand said, boy, that was a bad business model. We just let all those people come and crap on our land, ruin our environment, degrade our farming system, degrade our things, and they didn't even pay us the true fair price. That's a bad business model, and that's how we've been operating many times on this world. So I would urge Croatia to take the high ground, not follow others' lead. Don't allow other countries or other people to shit on your land and then sell them a premium product or a product at less than fair trade and total environmental cost. That means the cost of water, the cost of sustainability of that land, of that soil in the long term, because you're only investing against your future.
This is really sad and disturbing and alarming example, and I hope that what they have learned will give a guidance to other countries, including Croatia. Well, thank you, Marc, for sharing your knowledge and your experience. It was really inspiring and eye-opening. I'm sure that our conversation will have a positive impact on the Croatian people and Croatian experts. And I believe that this interview will contribute to improvement of the food production and the food quality in Croatia. Thank you so much for your time.
Oh, you're absolutely welcome. And as always, I could talk for hours. I'm passionate about this, and I'd like to get into some more practical solutions of how we could, in the future conversations, how we could teach the government and the farmers how to come together and find solutions, the higher ground to create better solutions. If you are having the wool pulled over your eyes to think that chemicals, pesticides, Monsanto, Bayer, DuPont, or any kind of glyphosate is good for you, your crops, or food, then I would just leave you with one test. I mentioned in my conversations that I would suggest that you use an IMO type of fertilizer, which is an organic fertilizer that you make yourself, and you can make it on a large scale, which stands for IMO stands for indigenous microorganism. It's something that heals the soils. It's used in permaculture and regenerative ag quite a lot, in Korean natural farming. I would like to say, please drink a cup of Monsanto's glyphosate, and please drink a cup of IMO, indigenous microorganism. I guarantee you, if you drink the IMO first, you're still going to be around and living because it's not going to do anything to harm you or harm your body. But after you drink the Monsanto chemical poison, which you're eventually putting your body in it, you'll probably be dead, you'll probably be sick, you might have cancer. And if you were to ask someone who's selling you those products to drink them, they wouldn't do it themselves. So why would you then later digest and put those things into your body? So not only they're ruining the biome of our soils and our earth, but they're also ruining our immunity, our gut health, our natural gut bacteria that helps keep us healthy and has a strong microorganisms to help us digest and process food. And they're calling good gut health the second brain. And so in reality, I don't want anybody to die or to drink chemicals, but let's not put them on our soils and on our food, and that it's just a bad idea. And chemical companies are polluting us with plastics and chemicals in our farming, in our oil, coal, and gas industries. That's all chemicals. We don't need them. We can do it in a much better way to live on our world. And so that would be my plea and pledge to you, that you integrate that thinking, one planet thinking, living within planetary boundaries, into your farms, into your business models, and in the way you eat and live yourself. That's a much better way to work.
Thank you. I couldn't agree more with you. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and expertise with us. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Nakon razgovora s Marcom, jako sam zabrinuta za zdravlje ljudi i budućnost ljudi u Hrvatskoj. A vi?